Good evening. The subject of our discussion this evening is a phrase in the Torah that I must admit causes believers in the Bible, believers in God's Word, a lot of grief. A lot of grief, as we shall see, because of the extent to which this phrase is misconstrued and misrepresented, even if inadvertently. And the phrase, of course, is an eye for an eye, an expression that appears in Exodus chapter 21, which is the focal point and springboard for our discussion this evening. It also appears in Leviticus chapter 24, and it appears kind of similarly also in Deuteronomy chapter 19. And inevitably, we need to put a good deal of effort into understanding what this phrase actually means. In order to do so, inevitably, we're going to have to dive into a Hebrew lesson here to understand what the actual text is telling us. Because, of course, it goes without saying that the Torah does not state an eye for an eye, because the Torah was not written in English. And inevitably understanding what the Torah does state is going to be a crucial dimension of our discussion. Before we begin, I feel compelled to make a general historical observation. And this is certainly by no means an observation that I make uniquely. I'm making it on the shoulders of many, many generations of scholars who have noted that there is no indication anywhere in all of the millennia since the Torah was given that there was ever a court operating based upon the Torah that understood an eye for an eye as literally indicating a punishment of gouging out a person's eye. Never. And, of course, on some plane, that starting point is also an end point. That is the realization that we have a well-defined, coherent tradition that the meaning of the Torah's words was never an eye for an eye in the manner in which it is conventionally presented by the Torah's detractors. But of course, simultaneously, recognizing that, we still need to ask ourselves, what is the Torah saying? And what does it mean? How do we understand the actual text of the Torah? And, inevitably, an additional question that we're also going to have to address this evening, if our contention that the Torah's phrase does not mean anything like gouging out an assailant's eye, then why is the phrase used in the Torah that it could at the very least lead to such a misunderstanding? So, of course, these are all issues that we're going to strive to address this evening. The starting point, again, is the realization of the existence of this tradition. But now, without any further ado, we launch directly into the text. As I already noted, we are beginning with Exodus chapter 21. And, of course, here we have it in verse 22. The circumstance described is a fight between two men, in the context of which an innocent bystander is hurt. And in the particular scenario described here, the innocent bystander is a pregnant woman. And the Torah distinguishes between two possible forms of injury, one being a miscarriage, that because she is struck by one of the men fighting, she miscarries. But in this first case, there is no irreversible harm to the woman herself. Under such circumstances, the Torah explicitly determines that there shall be financial compensation for the causing of the miscarriage, as opposed to in the second case. The second case, if any harm follows, and of course in context here that means a fatal injury to the woman, then the Torah stipulates you shall give life for life. Now, I'm going to note at the outset that it is a subject of dissension among Torah scholars as to whether in this instance in which the woman's life was lost, we relate to the assailant as a murderer, and under such circumstances, certainly if he is warned in advance by witnesses, then that would be a capital crime. And as stipulated in the Torah, the assailant would be put to death as a murderer, or that inasmuch as he didn't intend to hurt the woman, she was not the intended victim, perhaps in such a case it isn't considered to be a capital crime and the punishment is monetary, which would mean, for reasons that we're still going to have to discuss, that for, as in give life for life, would even in this case mean monetary compensation. Now again, that's a question. It's a question altogether when A intends to kill B, but instead kills C, is that considered to be capital murder or not? Good question. It's a question that I'm not going to be addressing this evening. We will rather be focusing upon what follows in verse 24. In addition to speaking of life for life, the Torah states eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, as you may have already noticed, I inserted in brackets the compensation of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Likewise, in verse 25, the compensation of burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Of course, the text doesn't say compensation of, the text says. Well, what does the text say? The text, again, is not written in English, it's written in Hebrew. The Hebrew reads, Ein tachat ein. And again, conventionally, we do translate that as an eye for an eye. We're going to have to explore at greater length what the word here is that's being used as the preposition between ein and ein, meaning eye and eye. Is it eye for an eye in the sense of taking vengeance by gouging out the assailant's eye? That's the question. I already told you at the outset that this is not the only instance in which we encounter this turn of phrase in the Torah. The second instance is in Leviticus chapter 24. Here, the Torah states, that if someone smites another person mortally, that is, a smiting that results in death, then the assailant, the murderer, shall surely be put to death. This, in the case of smiting a human being, and the Torah immediately establishes a crucial distinction. One who smites an animal mortally, killing an animal, shall make good, that is, shall pay for it. The compensation of life for life. The important contrast being that on the one hand, as we've noted in the past, the Torah is very strict on the subject of causing needless, gratuitous suffering to any living thing, even an animal. But the Torah makes it very clear that we do not relate to human beings as just another type of animal. There is a critical line of demarcation to be drawn, and as a result, the penalty for killing an animal is monetary compensation to the animal's owner. The penalty for deliberately killing a human being is death. Perhaps I should insert here an observation that in our day and age may be necessary. That is, as undoubtedly you are well aware, in many societies there is adamant opposition to the imposition of the death penalty under any set of circumstances. On the one hand, I feel compelled to share with you an observation in our tradition that if a court, basing itself upon Torah law, would actually invoke the death penalty and execute one criminal in 70 years, they would call that court a killer court. In other words, evidently, the frequency with which the death penalty was actually imposed was extremely low. Once in 70 years was regarded as excessive. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, to categorically oppose death penalties under any sets of circumstances whatsoever, even in the case of egregious crimes that are deliberately committed after having been forewarned of their severity, to oppose the death penalty under any circumstances, that doesn't signify an excessive concern for preservation of life. If there was such concern for the preservation of life, then perhaps we should be giving more thought to deterring potential murderers by driving home to them the realization that their act is so unpardonable that they will be punished with the most severe punishment imaginable, the death of the murderer. I suspect, rather, the cries for opposition to the death penalty under any circumstances at all represent, sorry to say, not excessive concern for preserving life, but rather blurring distinctions, equating the life of the murderer with the life of his victim. And that is moral relativism. That is the inability to truly indict criminal behavior for what it is and recognize that it needs to be punished. That is not anything that we should relish anything that we should encourage, and that clearly is negated by the attitude that is engendered through fidelity to the Torah. There are punishments for crimes. So, first point of emphasis here is the comparison. When one kills a human being, the punishment is indeed to be the death penalty. Depends on the circumstances, has to be deliberate, has to be knowingly, has to be after forewarning. But yes, there are circumstances in which this will be the punishment. When the victim is an animal, monetary restitution. Interesting to note, and we'll get back to this point, that in describing the need for payment, and that it is payment, the Torah states explicitly, you need to pay for it. The Torah describes that payment as life for life, using the same preposition that we saw before, tachat. Interesting, isn't it? But the Torah goes on to state, if a man maim his neighbor as he has done, so shall it be done to him. It's another expression that we're going to need to elucidate. And then it continues in much the same vein as in Exodus chapter 21. Speaks of fracture for fracture, eye for eye, there you have it again, tooth for tooth. As he has maimed a man, so shall it be rendered unto him. And of course, again, I inserted in brackets the words, the compensation of, for reasons that I'm still going to need to defend. The Torah goes on to affirm the need to pay for the slaying of an animal, in contrast to the need to put to death the killer of a human being. But again, of course, as I noted, these are two passages in the Torah in which we encounter same expression. Same expression in the Hebrew, same expression in translation. Ayin tachat ayin. Here rendered, eye for eye. But I said there was also another passage, Deuteronomy chapter 19. Now, you look at Deuteronomy chapter 19, first, to consider the context. The context is a false witness, a corrupt witness, who is deliberately arising to testify falsely against someone else. If that team of false witnesses is found to have perjured themselves in testifying falsely against their brother, here we see it in verse 18, the judges shall inquire diligently, and behold, if the witness be a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, then shall you do unto him as he purposed to do to his brother. In other words, if the witnesses falsely testified that the defendant had committed a capital crime, then as they strove to have their intended victim executed, instead they are executed. And of course, it doesn't only apply to capital crimes, capital cases. And that's how we get to verse 21 here. The Torah says, your eye shall not pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Whatever they purposed to do, whatever they wanted to impose upon their defendant, their intended victim, is instead done to them. You might be wondering, I said there are only two passages and one that was similar. This doesn't sound merely similar. Eye for eye. Sounds like the exact same formulation that we saw in Exodus chapter 21 and Leviticus chapter 24. The discerning eye may have already noted that the coloring of the text is different here, because in fact, despite the identical translation, the Hebrew text actually is not identical. Here it is ein be'ain, as opposed to ein tachat ein, a different preposition. Inevitably, we're going to have to understand them both. But patience. Again, in order to understand what's going on here, we need to consider what's taking place in the original Hebrew and what it means. So in order to do so, of course, inevitably we return to the original formulation of eye for eye, which was ein tachat ein. Now, here's your Hebrew lesson. Ein means eye. So, ein, eye, tachat, ein means tachat, whatever that means, an eye. Does it mean for? Is it an eye for eye? Good question. For that, we need to explore what does the Hebrew word tachat mean. So, a quick overview. The first place where tachat appears in Scripture is in Genesis chapter 1. Here you have it in verse 7. The Torah tells us God made the firmament, divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Under the firmament is the English translation of tachat. It means under. 2 verses later, God said that the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. Under, again, mitachat. So, the first meaning of tachat is under. It's preposition. It means under. That is manifestly the majority usage of the preposition tachat in biblical Hebrew. But that's not the only meaning that it has in biblical Hebrew. Because we have no further to look than Genesis chapter 2 to consider a different sense. We read in verse 21 that God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs or sides and closed up the place with flesh instead thereof. Instead is tachat. Tachtena is the construct form here, instead of it. And likewise, Genesis chapter 4, after Abel was slain by Cain, Torah reports, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, because God has appointed me another seed instead of Abel. For Cain slew him. Instead of, here you have it, tachat. You may be wondering, I was wondering, what's the connection between under and instead of? So first of all, it occurred to me that in English, you know, when an actor is ready to perform instead of the regular actor in a performance, that substitute actor who is ready to step in is called an understudy. In other words, the understudy is ready to be there instead. I don't think this is merely a technicality or a word game, because being able to serve instead of another means to take the place of the other. In some sense, to come in under the other, the position that is vacant and needs to be filled. So tachat, in its most basic sense and most common sense in biblical Hebrew, means under, but it also means instead of. And I'd like to share with you in that vein another 3 examples in Genesis in which it has that meaning. I think they're all fairly familiar examples. The first is the binding of Isaac. Abraham is ready to offer Isaac as an offering upon the altar, except that the angel of God calls to him, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. Don't do it. Don't harm the lad. And in the following verse, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a ram caught, or he beheld the ram after it had been caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered the ram as a burnt offering instead of his son. In the Hebrew, tachat, again, instead of. Likewise, in Genesis chapter 44, when Judah comes to intercede with the ruler of Egypt, who is intending to take Benjamin as his slave. Of course, you know it's Joseph, but that's beside the point. Judah, in pleading with the ruler, says, now, therefore, let your servant, I pray you, abide instead of the lad, a bondman, a slave to my Lord. Instead of, again, you already anticipate this, tachat. And finally, also in Genesis, chapter 50, we discussed this verse a few weeks back, when Joseph's brothers are fearful that he will take vengeance upon them after their father's death, Joseph reassures them. He says to them, fear not, for am I in the place of, or instead of, God. And again, of course, instead is tachat. So, we see that what tachat means, when it doesn't mean under, is not for so much as instead of, in the place of. Just to share with you a couple of additional dramatic examples from the prophecy of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 55, you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth before you in singing, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, and instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. And it will be to God for a memorial, for an everlasting sign that will not be cut off. Instead of, not for, instead of. Instead of the thorn comes the cypress, instead of the briar, the myrtle. Likewise, Isaiah chapter 60. Instead of your being forsaken and hated, so that no man pass through you, I will make you an eternal excellency, a joy of many generations, and of course, again, instead of. Tachat. And 2 verses later, the moving words of the prophet describing the reestablishment of the temple after exile, of the commonwealth of Judah after the return. Instead of the copper, I will bring gold. Instead of the iron, I will bring silver. Instead of the wood, brass. Instead of the stones, iron. Now, of course, as you may note, the translation that we're using without my emendations renders this as for. But for clearly in this sense of instead of. It doesn't mean for as any sort of vengeance, reciprocity. No, it means payment, replacing copper with gold, replacing the iron with silver, replacing the wood with brass, copper, replacing the stones with iron. Replacement instead of is called tachat in Hebrew. The implications with respect to monetary law and damages. Let's return to Exodus chapter 21. But Exodus chapter 21, some verses later. When the Torah speaks of damage inflicted by your property on someone else's property. The Torah speaks of it in terms of one man's ox hurting, goring another man's ox. I should just stress that if you think, how many people have oxen today? The essential principles apply whenever one person's property causes damage to another person's property. Now, what the Torah stipulates in verse 35 is what happens when one ox gores another one or otherwise hurts it so that it dies. But the two owners of the two oxen are obviously not any more guilty one than the other. That is, it was the ox that did it. The owner didn't do anything. So the Torah stipulates that they shall sell the live ox, divide its price, and the dead they shall also divide. And thus the loss is balanced between the two of them. That's if there wasn't any dereliction involved on the part of the owner of the goring ox. But if it was known that the ox was one to gore and the owner did not take precautions to guard it, then he is required to pay. And how does the Torah express that? He shall surely pay ox for ox. Now, I hope it's clear to us all. It would be utterly senseless, out of character, and inconceivable that what the Torah means by this, by what we've already seen, monetary restitution for property loss, would be kill the other guy's ox as punishment for the fact that his ox hurt the other ox. What does that accomplish? The purpose of these laws is to provide appropriate compensation for the person whose property was damaged. So paying ox for ox, and indeed, the Torah makes it clear, it is paying. In the Hebrew, yishalem. Paying means monetary compensation. It doesn't mean reciprocity. It doesn't mean vengeance. It means payback. In the same vein, in the following verse, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay money. He pays 5 oxen for an ox, 4 oxen for a sheep, 4, in both of these instances, in the Hebrew is tachat. Instead of. The payment is intended to be instead of the loss that was incurred by the victim. And indeed, in the same vein, we already noted this first time around, when we consider what takes place in Leviticus chapter 24. The Torah uses virtually the exact same language. He who smites a beast mortally shall pay for it. in this case, shall pay for it, verse 18, life for life. What does life for life mean? It's payment. It's not killing the animal just to take vengeance upon the assailant. It is making restitution. So payment. And of course, again, I'm sure I need not point out to you, the word in Hebrew is tachat. That's what it means. 3 verses afterward, and he who smites a beast, again, almost the exact same expression, shall pay for it, as opposed to he who kills a man shall be put to death. Manifestly, we're speaking about killing a man, and as we already saw earlier on, deliberately killing a human being is a capital crime, and it is punished with capital punishment. But in verse 18, talking about the animal, life for life doesn't mean anything that is intended to reciprocate, to punish the assailant. It is intended to make good to the victim, paying back. So conclusion, this is our first interim conclusion here, is that, again, the Torah doesn't say eye for eye. The Torah says ayin tachat ayin. You can translate that eye for eye if you so choose. Just make sure you understand that for here means instead of. In other words, if the assailant destroyed the victim's eye, he needs to provide an instead of the monetary compensation to make good to the victim what the victim lost. Gouging out the assailant's eye is not going to magically heal the victim's eye. And therefore, it clearly could not possibly be what the Torah intended in saying tachat, meaning instead of, in the place of, which is monetary restitution. That's observation number 1. But of course, we're not finished yet. We also have the formulation that we saw in Leviticus chapter 24 that we need to understand. And if a man maims his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Now again, I inserted here the compensation of fracture for fracture. But maybe that's not what it means. Of course, we already know. Tachat. It does. But still is troubling, is it not? As he has done, so shall it be done to him. And again, in verse 20, as he has maimed a man, so shall it be rendered to him. What does that mean? Well, let's consider another passage in which we find a very similar formulation. In Judges chapter 15, the story of Samson. Samson, after learning that his Philistine father-in-law had given his wife to another man, punishes the Philistines, sets their fields upon fire, destroys their produce, and the Philistines then burnt Samson's wife and her father with fire. Whereupon Samson says, if you do after this manner, surely I will be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And we read that he exacted vengeance from them. He smote them hip and thigh with great slaughter. The next scene is the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah, spread themselves against Lehi, and they tell the men of Judah that the reason they have come is to bind Samson, to do to him as he has done to us. Now note, here we're speaking about doing to him as he did to us. They could very possibly mean actual reciprocity, doing to him what he did to other Philistines. But Maybe that's what it was in their mind. Look what happens in verse 11. 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam, where Samson was staying, and said to him, "Don't you know that the Philistines are our rulers? What did you do? You're getting us all into trouble." And Samson responds, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." So I have done to them. They took his wife, or they burned his wife and father-in-law in fire. That's not what he did. Rather, he, from his perspective, was exacting payment that was commensurate with what they had done. But it's not reciprocity in the sense of doing to them exactly what they had done to him. Two different things. Exacting payment, yes. But reciprocity? Does it really mean that they did to me the following and that's exactly what I'm going to do to them? No, that's not what it means. Likewise, in the prophecy of Obadiah, "For the day of God is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your dealing shall return upon your own head. For as you have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually." This is punishment of the nations for what they did to God's holy people. Does it mean, again, that they are being punished precisely in the same way as what they had done to God's holy people? No. Rather, in much the same vein that we speak of payment in monetary law. And indeed, in the same vein that Samson spoke of doing to the Philistines what they had done to him, God, as it were, needs to balance the books. There has to be payback. For what the nations did, they will pay. And, on the one hand, of course, it should not be in any way construed as a specific punishment for deeds that were done in an earlier epoch, because, as the Torah states emphatically in Deuteronomy, every man dies by his sin. Neither is a man who has chosen the path of wickedness saved because of his ancestors' righteousness, nor is a man who is righteous damned to suffer because of the crimes of wicked ancestors. But still and all, there is this vast balancing of the ledger that God does. That's instead of. And that is in context here, again, as so too. It's payment. It's not wreaking vengeance or precise reciprocity. It's bringing the books, as it were, into appropriate balance. That covers the formulation that we saw in Leviticus, as well as the formulation that we saw in Exodus chapter 21. There is that third formulation that we saw pertaining to the corrupt witnesses in Deuteronomy chapter 19. And again, I remind you, the translation here tells us life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. But the Hebrew does not correspond to what we saw in Exodus and Leviticus. Here it's not ayin tachat ayin. It is rather, to be precise, ayin be'ayin, nefesh be'nefesh, Ein, ein, shen, b'shen, yad, b'yad, regel, b'ragel. Specifically, that means the preposition, rather than being tachat, is the prefix be that appears before its object. And of course, inevitably, we need to ask ourselves, exactly what does that mean? And when we consider what that prepositional prefix means elsewhere, the answer becomes clear. Consider in Genesis chapter 29, when Lavan says to Jacob, give me your wages, tell me what you want to be paid for taking care of the sheep. The Torah reports, Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. For, in the Hebrew, be, exactly the same syntactical formulation as we find in Deuteronomy chapter 19. For as the be. And indeed, 2 verses afterward, and Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. Again, the preposition is be Rachel. What does the preposition mean here? Well, in the context, it's pretty straightforward. We're speaking about payback. Jacob offers to work for 7 years in order to pay for Rachel's hand in marriage. Now, mind you, you may object to the whole notion of paying the prospective father-in-law in order to marry his daughter, but of course, remember that Laban is not necessarily our role model. That's what he stipulated, so that's what he got. For our purposes, again, the crucial implication of this discussion is for here. The be prepositional prefix in the Hebrew means payment. So once again, we're speaking payment. We are not speaking about gouging out the assailant's eye. We're speaking about making restitution, paying back. So in all these passages, both ein, tachat ein, and ein, be'ayin, either one being translated as eye for eye, neither means physically gouging out an eye for an eye. God forbid. Again, this is the derogation of God's word to imply that's what it meant, or to imply that it was ever construed to mean that. Because again, in all of our history, courts operating based upon the laws of the Torah never understood these words as implying that. So at this stage, consider, we've already noted the tradition clearly understands eye for eye as meaning monetary restitution. And furthermore, when we delve into the actual syntax of the Torah, we recognize the words mean monetary restitution. There's a third point to appreciate in this progression, and that is that when we consider the lessons of the Torah as they pertain to causing damage, any other conclusion manifestly would be so utterly out of character as to make no sense at all. Just consider another passage in Exodus chapter 21, here speaking of the ox that gores a human being. But again, if there was no reason to anticipate that this ox was going to gore, you can't fault the owner. This is, again, in modern terms, the equivalent of inadvertent damage being caused by one's property on another human being. So granted, this isn't property damaging property. This is property damaging a human life. But still, the owner of the property that caused damage didn't do anything to be liable. So, the Torah states, on the one hand, the ox shall be stoned. The ox is to be put to death. But the owner of the ox is clear, unpunished. However, there's an important caveat. If the ox was wont to devour in time past, and warning had been given to its owner, and he did not take precautions to guard it, and then it kills a man or woman, on the one hand, still not any deliberate crime perpetrated by the owner of the ox, except that he was derelict, he was negligent. States the Torah, under such circumstances, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner, well, the Hebrew states, shall be put to death. But, as I noted in brackets, that means shall deserve to be put to death. Upon what basis do I state that? Very simply, the next verse. The next verse tells us, when an atonement fine is imposed, upon the owner of the ox, then he gives redemption of his life as it is imposed upon him by the court. Now let's consider what that means. What that means in context, of course, is that inasmuch as this was not, after all, a deliberate act that was perpetrated by the owner of the ox, it was, after all, something that was done by the ox, the owner was derelict. You can't actually put someone under such circumstances to death. And if what was done by the owner is not a deliberate act of violence that would result in capital punishment, the only punishments that are imposed by the Torah as an alternative are monetary. So even though the Torah states that the owner deserves to be put to death, indeed, simple text reads, the owner shall be put to death. He's not put to death. He is fined. Because he did not commit a capital crime, the punishment is monetary. There is no bodily injury that is imposed under such circumstances. Indeed, this message becomes clear when we consider the alternative. In Numbers chapter 35, here the Torah speaks of the deliberate murderer. And speaking of the deliberate murderer, again, we already know this. I'm going to be completely unapologetic about this. The Torah states that if someone deliberately takes another life, he is to be put to death. Whoever kills any person, the murderer shall be slain at the mouth of witnesses. That is, only eyewitness testimony is sufficient, not circumstantial evidence. One witness shall not testify against any person for him to die. Continuation. Moreover, you shall take no atonement compensation for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. Here, as opposed to in the instance in which the owner of the ox was derelict and is described as deserving to die, but still hasn't committed an actual capital crime, here he has. Here he has deliberately committed a murder, and as opposed to there, where there is the monetary fine, the atonement compensation that is imposed, here it's going to be the death penalty. And there is no room for leniency in allowing the deliberate murderer to avoid the death penalty by paying a monetary penalty. Because, note the expression used, the murderer is guilty of death. Only when someone is guilty of death is monetary restitution not acceptable. If he's not guilty of death, monetary restitution is acceptable. And so indeed, when we consider the case of the assailant, the punishment is not going to be bodily injury. The punishment is indeed going to be monetary. But when all is said and done, you might even consider this whole exercise to be superfluous when you consider that indeed, in Exodus chapter 21, where we began, we see this fairly explicitly. The Torah tells us there, in verse 18, if men fight and one smites the other with stone or fist, and the victim doesn't die, but becomes bedridden, so as long as he is bedridden, there is the possibility that he may die. If he dies, the assailant is not merely an assailant, he's also a murderer. But if the victim rises again and works outside on his own support, then the assailant is acquitted of the death penalty as a murderer because the victim survived. But what do we demand of him? We don't demand of him any sort of bodily injury in punishment for having hurt the victim. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, that is the loss of work, and shall pay for his complete cure. That is, you have to pay for the days of work that the victim missed, and you have to pay all the medical bills. That's it. Not only those payments, there are other payments as well that may be imposed, causing physical anguish to the victim, other dimensions, the embarrassment of the victim to which the victim was subjected by being assaulted in the manner in which he was. If there is any disability that also needs to be covered financially by the assailant. But these are all monetary. All of the punishments that are imposed are monetary impositions, nothing more than monetary punishment. Certainly not imposing bodily injury. So, of course, to that extent, besides our appreciation that we have a well-defined tradition that understands an eye for an eye as meaning exclusively monetary compensation, and besides the careful analysis of the syntax in the Torah that makes it clear that we mean monetary compensation, besides these, the realization that so far as the Torah is concerned, if we are not dealing with a capital crime in interpersonal relationships, the punishment then inevitably will be monetary compensation, not bodily injury. And so, to that extent, at this point, I hope we have adequately resolved the question of what the Torah means when it says ayin tachat ayin, or ayin be'ayin, an eye for an eye. But of course, there still is the additional dimension that needs to be addressed, and that is, so why does the Torah say something that could be so readily misconstrued? Why does the Torah not tell us outright that the punishment is to be explicitly financial? I turn to the last verses on the last page here, in Numbers chapter 15. The Torah stipulates, there shall be one statute for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you, statute forever throughout all the generations. One law, or alternatively, one instruction, one teaching, Torah. And one ordinance, or alternatively, one law, one judgment, shall there be for you. One law, one judgment. one set of instructions. Why am I emphasizing this here? Well, two reasons. The first is fairly straightforward and technical. I remind you that way back in the passage from Leviticus chapter 24, we saw a similar formulation, this in chapter 24, verse 22. You shall have one manner of law as well for the stranger as for the homeborn, for I am God your Lord. The relevance on the most obvious plane, again, technically speaking, that the laws of the Torah need to be applied with equivalence to all. Now, mind you, that in itself is enough of a reason that an eye for an eye could not possibly be understood literally. If the assailant had only one eye and destroyed one eye of a two-eyed victim, would it be indeed an equivalence to gouge out the one remaining eye of the assailant and he ends up completely blind? And moreover, could we ever really apply the laws of the Torah under such a set of circumstances equivalently to all? The circumstances for every individual are different. The extent to which an individual could endure such a procedure manifestly varies. Clearly, even on a technical plane, the mandate to apply the laws of the Torah equivalently to all necessitates an eye for an eye being a financial imposition rather than a bodily injury. That's, as I already noted, the technical aspect that I wanted to stress with these verses from Numbers chapter 15. But the more important dimension that I think it is crucial for us to consider here is, on the one hand, when we consider why it is of such great importance for the Torah to stress equivalence. Again, on law, instruction, teaching, judgment. The answer, as we've noted in other contexts as well, is because the Torah clearly is bent on establishing a covenantal community. A covenantal community can only exist when all of its members are bound together by a shared way of life. That's not to imply that the only thing that is necessary in establishing a covenantal community is such a shared way of life, but it is part of the critical means for establishing such a sense of community. To that extent, given that the Torah clearly regards such a way of life that binds the members and provides a bond that unites the members, we look at the written words of the Torah and cannot help but be confounded, because the words written in the Torah are so vague. They don't provide us with any clearly delineated way of life. So much of the essential framework of living a life of the Torah, how to keep the Sabbath, how to observe the dietary laws, not to mention innumerable examples that pertain to interpersonal relationships. All these in the written Torah seem to us to be so hopelessly vague as to be impracticable. So if that's the case, then why indeed is the Torah demanding of us the establishment of a community when it has failed to give us the detailed framework to enable us to legislate the way of life of such a community? Inevitably, our answer to this question is concomitant with the written word is the oral tradition. Not only the oral tradition that tells us how to understand the written word, but also that tells us how to apply it. The written word of the Torah, the written, revealed word of God, as the medium implies, writing doesn't change, doesn't vary, doesn't evolve. It is there to present to us the absolute, unalterable truths of God revealed to the world. The absolute, unalterable truths of God revealed to the world also. Don't change, don't move, don't evolve. The written word is the appropriate medium for preserving those. But those truths aren't necessarily practicable on a this worldly level. That's an additional dimension. Taking these sublime truths and applying it to all of the complexities of life in this world. On the level of the sublime divine truths revealed to the world, on the level then of the written text of the Torah could only state an eye for an eye, a life for a life. Had the written word said monetary restitution, it would have debased the value of life, debased the value of a human limb, to imply that there is a price tag. There is no price tag. On the level of divine truths, there is nothing of commensurate value to a human life or to even a human limb, a component of that life that is equivalent to it other than it itself, only an eye for an eye and nothing less. But again, that's on the level of the revealed word. On the level of the oral tradition that tells us how to apply it. The oral tradition is about the practical actualization of these truths. The oral tradition then teaches us, yeah, this truth is a great truth, but you can't live that way. And you're not supposed to live that way. In this world, the sublime truth of an eye for an eye means monetary restitution, and monetary restitution alone. And of course, inevitably, the moral of our story and the end point of our story is we need both. Without the written word, we would not have the absolute, unalterable truths of God revealed to the world as our guide. Without the oral tradition, we would have the truth, but we wouldn't have a clue how properly to apply those truths in the variegated world in which we live. We need both. We need the truth, and we need to know how to apply them. Because it is only through these both that we can glean God's blessings learning His truths, and actualizing them in our lives, in this world. So we learn the truth of an eye for an eye. We actualize it in this world as monetary restitution. Ultimately, we need both those components, the written word and the oral tradition, in order to make this world a stage for God's will to be done, in order to make this world a more godly place. God bless you.